Hello everyone. Welcome to this École des Modernités lecture. Thank you for joining us online. We are happy tonight to have a lecture given by Professor Sylvester Okwunodu Ogbechie. Sylvester Okwunodu Ogbechie is Professor of History of Art and Architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara. His research focuses on African and African diaspora arts, modern and contemporary art, cultural informatics, and African cultural patrimony. Among his publications, Ogbechie is the author of Ben Nwanwu, The Making of an African Modernist, published in 2008, and Making History, African Collectors and the Canon of African Collection, published in 2011. He is also working on a book titled The Curator as a Culture Broker, Representing Africa in Global Contemporary Art. The lecture Professor Ogbechie will be giving tonight is entitled Negotiating Blackness, Modern Art and African Identities in Paris, 1920-1970, and it will focus on key figures from the African continent, namely Aina Onabolu, Ernest Mancoba, Gerard Sekoto, Gazbia Sirry, and Iba Ndiaye, who made their path in Paris and for whom that city changed their career. So I'd like to thank you again, Sylvester, for accepting this lecture, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hugo. Good evening to everyone in Paris, and good morning to everyone out here in the California region. I would like to thank the Fondation Giacometti Institute, and especially Hugo Daniel, for inviting me to give this presentation. I am pleased to be here. For my French audience, bienvenue. Je suis désolé, je ne peux pas présenter ma conférence en français. Mon français n'est pas assez bon. Merci de votre compréhension. My presentation discusses modern and African artists who lived in Paris at important points in their careers, and how they negotiated Blackness, modernism, and African identities in Paris as a global context of practice. We are looking at them under these rubrics here. These are the artists as I list them out. I argue, focusing on Aina Onabolu, Ernest Mancoba, Gerard Sekoto, Gazbia Sirry, and Iba Ndiaye, I argue that France's colonial history and the activities of these African artists in the city makes Paris an important site for the history and discourse of modern African art. I analyze the kinds of art trainings they received and how their interaction with various individuals and contexts of practice in Paris maps their involvement in modernist discourses. Modern African art's cosmopolitan orientation and its deployment of visual languages of modernism framed the international reception of these artists, all of whom emerged from cosmopolitan urban centers in Africa. We therefore need new interpretative frameworks to redefine their works as platforms for the expression of intent, action, and intellectual engagement in the global contexts of modernism. In November 1946, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, that is UNESCO, presented an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in Paris. Titled the Exposition Internationale d'Art Moderne, the exhibition inaugurated an ambitious agenda to promote world peace through international cooperation in education, sciences, and culture. In addition to notable European modern artists such as Pablo Picasso and Francis Bacon, the exhibition also included artworks by the Nigerian artist Ben Nwanwu, whom you see on your screen. Julian Huxley, Director General of UNESCO from 1946 to 1948, specifically invited Nwanwu's participation in the exhibition, and it served the artist as a launching pad for an acclaimed career as an internationally renowned modern or African modern artist. The UNESCO exhibition contributed to a polycentric and global art canon through the diversity of artists it represented. And similar to Nwanwu's inclusion in this exhibition, The artists I discussed below lived or worked in Paris at important points in their career. I want to point out in this slide you're looking at here a very important element. This is Enwonwu's most famous sculpture titled Rising Sun or Anyanwu in Igbo. This is a sculpture by Alberto Giacometti titled Walking Man 1, and you can see that the attenuated figures that appear in this work were used to compare it to Enwonwu's sculptures. Giacometti being an older artist, Enwonwu was immediately, well, not accused, but referenced as having adopted the style of Giacometti. However, Enwonwu complained that Giacometti was adopting his style from African sculptures, and it was therefore a very wrong assumption to accuse him of copying or imitating Giacometti. Now, the artists, I discuss here worked, studied, or lived in Paris at important points in their careers. So in the years between 1920 and 1970, these are the artists I'm discussing. That's Aina Onabolu, Ernest Mancoba, Gerard Sekoto, Gazbia Sirry, and Iba Ndiaye. Many African artists circulated through Paris between 1920 and 1970. And if we read this against the concurrent history of France's colonial and age African American cultural intervention, Paris emerges as an important site in the discourse of Blackness and African modernism. I am interested in how the sojourn of these artists in the city redefines them as active agents in narratives of global modernity, given that they all operated in cosmopolitan contexts, both in Africa and in Europe. The artists I discuss come from Lagos, and in the slides here, that's Dakar, Lagos, Johannesburg, and Cairo. They come from Lagos, from Dakar, from Johannesburg, and Cairo. Some passed through Paris briefly, while others spent longer durations or lived out their lives there. And Aina Onabolu, for example, he was born in 1881 and died in 1963. He studied at the Académie Julian in Paris in 1922 before returning to Nigeria, where his practice unfolded for 4 decades thereafter. South African artist Ernest Mancoba arrived in Paris in 1938 from Cape Town, fleeing South Africa's repressive governance. He lived in France until his death 64 years later. Confronted with similar constraints, Gerard Sekoto moved from South Africa to live in exile in France. Sekoto, like Mancoba, is considered one of South Africa's earliest modernists, and his paintings chronicle the traumatic changes forced on Black South Africans by an emergent apartheid system during the 1940s. Egyptian artist Gazbia Sirry studied at the studio of Marcel Gromer in Paris in 1951 and contributed to a feminist consciousness of what it meant to be a modern Egyptian in a world of conflicting and complementary political, cultural, and artistic ideologies. Senegalese artist Iba Ndiaye studied in France from 1948 to 1959 and returned to live in Paris from 1966 until his death in 2008. I have listed these artists chronologically to reflect on how divergent historical contexts such as colonialism, First and Second World Wars, Cold War politics, nationalist struggles, and post-colonialism impacted their careers and structured how they negotiated Blackness, modern art, and African identities in Paris. From World War II onwards, the history and global politics of the world was constructed of binary opposites that pitted capitalism against socialism and the unfolding telos of modern art, which defined European modernism against the assumed primitivism of African and other non-Western artists. Yet, Paris at this time was also home to the intense and varied creativity of a diverse group of foreign artists. They had come to the city with different motives and aspirations, and the plurality of their languages and visions defies attempts to categorize their works as primitive in any sense of the word. So the sojourn of African artists in Paris unfolded as an overlapping sequence of artistic engagements. The particulars of their individual histories styles, and artistic orientations vary, and I subject this to close scrutiny. This is because whereas European or American art genealogies tend to be discussed in terms of ideas and imagination, art from outside that realm still often gets pegged to artists' identities and framed as the product of experiences marked as order. Too often, African modern artists are seen as bearers of ideological platforms rather than agents of individual expression. I argue we need to reevaluate such simplistic framing, bearing in mind how their cosmopolitan histories and professional practice linked Paris to various African sites of modernist discourse. I am therefore interested in what their presence in Paris reveals. What kinds of art training did they receive and who did they interact with? How does this help us to evaluate their art and involvement in sites and contexts of modern art? How did they engage or contest the emergent politics of Pan-African identity? And above all, what kinds of interpretative frameworks are needed to define their art, their works as platforms for the expression of intent and intellectual engagement? These art historical issues, I think, have not been given enough attention, and they require more analysis. So, Black Paris, race and representation in the City of Light. The notion of Black Paris, identifying the intersection of African Americans, Africans, and other diaspora Blacks in the city, is the subject of serious study in African American history and also in African modern art. African Americans left a lasting mark on Paris during the slide, especially during the Jazz Age, and you can see in this slide here, this book by William Schack, which talks about Harlem and Montmartre, a Paris jazz story between the Great Wars. And then this Michel's jazz band is an example of the kind of African-American bands that played in that region. He was, there was so much of these jazz bands and jazz performances in Paris that the area was dubbed, Black Broadway in Paris. And this is, of course, the person who started it all, Lieutenant James Rees Europe, conducting the 369th, regiment, composed mostly of African-American soldiers. And this was a regimental band that he controlled that played jazz music significantly during the period in question. So, starting from the Jazz Age, when Paris became a haven for those fleeing the repressive policies of Jim Crow segregation in the USA, jazz musicians were especially prominent among those seeking refuge in Paris. Thus, starting with Henry Ossawa Turner, who moved to Paris in 1891 to study at the Académie Julian, Black artists and writers sought in Paris a freedom to create and were received as bearers of unique cultural sensibilities. European avant-garde artists fetishized Black culture. Excuse me for a minute here, if I can move this somewhere else. That's one. All right. European avant-garde artists fetishized Black culture, music, and celebrated performers like Josephine Baker, who on November 30th, 2021, was inducted into the Pantheon, the mausoleum of French heroes, often described as the temple of the French nation. And these are images of Josephine Baker projected onto the Pantheon monument during her induction. Baker was a world-renowned performer, a World War II spy for France, a Legion of Honor recipient, and political activist who fought against racial injustice. And she became a French citizen and lived out her life in France. So what we're looking at here is that Paris was also a key location for the emergence of anti-colonial Pan-African ideology that originated with W.E.B. Du Bois' 1919 Pan-African Congress. It was the site of the 1956 First International Congress of Black Writers and Artists, which was organized at the Sorbonne by Alain Diop to bring together West Indians, Americans, and Africans in order to discuss Marcus Garvey's vision of a unified Black world. These events bookmark an important history of global Black identity activism. Furthermore, Paris looms large in canonical histories of modernism as the gathering place of the most prominent Euro-modernists and the all site of the modern art movement. In his seminal book, The Black Atlantic, Paul Gilroy described Europe, Africa, and the African diaspora as interconnected contexts that produced a distinctively modern transatlantic cultural and political space that is not specifically African, American, Caribbean, British, or French, but a hybrid mix of all these identities at once. In this regard, we can see Paris as a charged site for the transcontinental and transatlantic circulation of ideas, texts, and objects. As significant for its imaginary topography as for its actual landscape, the Paris inhabited by Black people refers as much to the product of such international traffic as it does to the real conditions of Black life in Paris itself. The city is therefore both real and mythical in nature. France itself was a colonial empire whose reach and influence remains central to the post-colonial imagination of its former African colonies. For people of African descent who lived in Paris, their approaches to public self-representation were born in significant part of the Atlantic power structure's attempt to deny them access to cosmopolitan subjectivity. As such, the value of Paris as a special space for Black transnational interaction, exchange, and dialogue is remarkable to the extent that such transnational interactions have been in turn instrumental to the broader intellectual, literary, and political projects that fought against the domination of capitals, empires, and colonial forms of subjectivity. For Blacks in Paris, the traffic in ideas within the terrain of the Black Atlantic was never merely linear or unidirectional. Rather, African American and Caribbean students learned of Africa, its languages, religions, and customs firsthand from their African classmates, and the young Africans from France's colonies gained insight into the perseverance of Africanness and Africanism within populations long absent from the continent itself. Through this contact, African students found a means of locating their experiences in the colonial system within a larger evolutionary structure, fighting against oppression and discrimination on both sides of the Atlantic. Both groups translated the knowledge they gained into powerful prescriptions for political action in nationalist and post-colonial struggle. One might thus conclude that Paris was a city where everything was possible, a land of liberty, fraternity, and equality without the shackles of racial discrimination. However, for many Africans, it was in reality a place of great difficulty as they negotiated their status as colonial citizens within a European social order that regarded them as inferior. Harry C. Alford argues that beyond the rhetoric of freedom and racial integration, Blacks in France are essentially invisible, and that held in the past and seems to actually hold in many ways for today. There are very few Blacks who are in any level of governance in France as we know it. I might be wrong in this, but that's this was somebody writing as at 2020. Yet, as Maureen Murphy noted, Paris was also the home to this intense and varied creativity of Blacks and a diverse group of these artists, who have come to the city with different motives and aspirations and created the artworks in a plurality of languages that defies attempts to categorize the artworks in any simple manner. So locating the African modernist artists we discussed here within the cosmopolitan complexity of their lived experience in Paris allows us to begin shaping the theoretical tools capable of dealing with the engagement in this moment of shared history. The career of Nigerian artist Aina Onabolu remarkably or arguably marks the beginning of modern African art. Onabolu is usually described as the pioneer modern African artist, but that's only if we're talking about people who painted, who did easel painting and that kind of stuff. Photography had already been a very major practice in West Africa and other African sites for several decades before Onabolu began to work. But in any case, we're discussing here the emergence of easel painting as a very specific technology of representation. In that regard, we can consider Onabolu one of the very first, well, at least Black artists, who picked up this medium. Originally self-taught, Onabolu enrolled at the Académie Julian in 1922 after studying at St. John's Wood School of Art in London. Now, these are some of Onabolu's artworks. You can see this, his painting, A Nigerian Weaver, was used as the central poster for the British Empire exhibition in London in 1924. This is a painting he did before he got formal education in art, his portrait of Mrs. Spencer Savage, done in 1906. So this shows Onabolu's self-training, as it were, before he then attended the Académie Julian, where he studied new techniques of drawing and painting. And, I'm going to get to these other images quite soon. So the famous Académie Julian was established in 1868 by painter and administrator Rodolphe Julian, who, set it up as a private school for art students. Founded at a time when art was about to undergo a long series of crucial mutations, the Académie Julian played host to painters and sculptors of every kind and persuasion, and never tried to make them hew to any one particular line. According to John Russell, more than 50 nationalities were represented at the school during its glory years, including Turks, Syrians, Peruvians, Chileans, Japanese, and an African student who gave the school its ethnic richness. It also admitted female students at a time when they couldn't study in official French art schools. And this is a painting by one of those female students, showing female artists at the Académie Julian doing a live painting from a live model. On the left here on the screen, you can see Aina Onabolu listed on the list of Académie Julian alumni. There are very few pictures of Onabolu for some odd reason, but you can see it's listed here. If you look at the other list, you've got Switzerland, Belgium, France, New Zealand, Lebanon, Poland, United Kingdom, China, and the United States. So this gives you a very, clear idea of the international nature of the school, as it were. During the Académie Julian's golden age, during its golden age from 1875 to 1925, the school was one of the best art schools of its type. It attracted talented students and teachers, and many graduates from that era went on to become some of the greatest modern artists of the late 19th and early 20th century. They include Diego Rivera of Mexico, Marcel Duchamp of France, Robert Rauschenberg of the USA, Henry Moore of the United Kingdom, Shahul Lahiri of India, and Jean Dubuffet of France. You can recognize in some of these names key figures of modern and of modern art in the era under discussion. So the overall list of its graduates is remarkable. But if the Académie Julian has a unique place among schools of art, it's not simply for big names, no matter how impressive. It is because the school operated as a free city of the spirit and a miniature cosmopolis. Onabolu was the only notable Black African graduate of the Académie Julian, and even if the artists mentioned above were not his contemporaries, his presence at this institution requires greater investigation to identify its impact on his work. Onabolu's interest in developing modern art in Africa was a fundamental aspect of his career as an artist. He was obsessed with British history painter Joshua Reynolds and self-published a treatise in which he outlined a history of art that celebrated painting a la Reynolds as exemplar. Onabolu's British education is evident in this narrative, but his time at the Académie Julian is evident in his predilection for drawing nude figures, of which you can see one here. Drawing nude female figures. Nudes were an established part of many art school curricula, but were particularly favored at the Académie Julian. The slide I showed earlier, the semi-nude figure that was being studied for painting is an example of that. During his studies, Onabolu also investigated a wide range of continental European art and studied the works of Renaissance artists in situ. He appropriated imagery from a fresco painting by the Italian Renaissance artist Masaccio titled Expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Onabolu's version of this painting, Adam and Eve, which you can see here, the original painting, and on the upper right-hand corner of the slide, the original painting and Onabolu's version of the painting. Onabolu's version of this painting, titled Adam and Eve, painted in 1954, adapted Masasio's artwork with a notable twist. He added fig leaves to the naked figures in deference to his staunch Christian morality. As a member of the Black Victorian Lagos elite in colonial Nigeria, Onabolu emerged from a cosmopolitan, multi-ethnic, multicultural, politically active environment of African intellectuals locked in anti-colonial contestations with the British government. In that regard, his artworks documented efforts by members of the Nigerian intellectual elite to narrate themselves into being by deploying the visual arts as a counter-narrative to colonial effacement of the African subject. He expressed this aspiration through stately portraits of Lagos upper-class society, including notable doctors, lawyers, engineers, chiefs, and local rulers. His portrait of Mrs. Spencer Savage, done in 1906, showed he had achieved remarkable capability through self-education before he enrolled at the Académie Julian. Privately, he produced nude and semi-nude studies that were mostly drawings of women. This was a radical act in a colonial culture in which both Christianity and Yoruba ethics discouraged such imagery. For the rest of his career, Onabolu foregrounded techniques he learned at the Académie Julian in his art, which did not reflect prevailing artistic orthodoxies of the sort represented by Picasso and other Euro-modernists. You must remember, European artists were adopting African abstract forms to reconfigure their art. Onabolu adopting European naturalistic representation as a basis for his own modern art was an equally valid move for him at this particular period of time. Aspects of his painting, in spite of his, of the fact that we don't see any obviously modernist, tech styles or in his work, aspects of his painting, like his detailed patterning of textiles, shallow pictorial space, elongation of figures and muted tonalities, and limited color palettes, all suggest he was quite aware of ongoing modernist experiments and that this might have influenced his aesthetic choices in subtle ways. There is thus an argument to be made that Onabolu's formal education at the Académie Julian, his study of classical painting techniques, and his appropriation of Italian frescoes are under-theorized aspects of his artistic practice. The fact that he studied at the Académie Julian is often mentioned without comment, as if it's irrelevant to his subsequent development. It might well be, but that awaits serious examination of his oeuvre. In the meantime, reading this context into Onabolu's art greatly expands and complicates extant narratives of modern African art. Ernest Mancoba, Race, Freedom, and Abstraction. Ernest Mancoba's art has undergone significant re-evaluation since British critic Rashid Arain credited his erasure in art history to racism and ethnocentrism. Mancoba is famous for his career as a pioneer South African modernist, for his involvement with the abstract art movement in Europe, his membership in the Cobra art movement in Denmark, which was a very important modern art movement, and his artistic career in Paris. Born in 1904 to a black miner in Torfontein near Johannesburg, he attended the Diocesan Teachers Training College, or Grace Dieu, in Pietersburg, where Sister Pauline, a nun, taught him to sculpt, and you can see examples of his sculptures, shown on the screen here. Mancoba produced sculptures such as African Madonna, this one here, 1929, and Mata Christi, in 1934, both in wood. And he worked in various capacities before he left South Africa for Europe in 1938. Sorry, excuse me. Arriving in Paris after a brief stop in London, Mancoba belonged to the black colonial elite and he wanted to become an artist from an early age, but was denied opportunities for professional recognition in South Africa. He received a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Fort Hare, and afterwards, he relocated to Cape Town, where he met Lippi Lifshitz, a South African sculptor born in Lithuania, who told him about the growing influence of African art in Europe. Lifshitz praised Paris as an unparalleled center of artistic concern and introduced Mancoba to Paul Guillaume's book, Primitive Negro Sculpture. This book sparked his interest in emigrating to Paris. By the time Mancoba arrived in Paris, he was 34 years old and already a mature sculptor whose works focused on Christian and African themes and were rendered in a figurative style. His subsequent pivot to abstract art was thus significant. In Paris, he studied at the École des Arts Décoratifs at the Rue Dôme and established an atelier in Rue Daguerre. He interacted with artists of the Danish Surrealist group such as Elia Biel, Richard Mortensen, and Egil Jacobsen, with American artists Henry Goetz, German expressionist painter Erwin Grauman, and German anti-Nazi artists such as Hans Hartung. He became close friends with Alberto Giacometti in 1938 and rented a room on top of Giacometti's atelier, which I thought was quite fitting since I'm giving this talk at the Fondation Giacometti. So his intellectual circle included European modernists such as Joan Miro, Max Ernst, Yves Tanguy, and Constantin Brancusi. During World War II, he was interned in Saint Denis for 4 years by German occupation forces. We can see from this list of names I've read out there that Mancoba was very seriously plugged into the circuit of modern art in Europe. Yet histories of modern art in Europe completely omit his presence. And, he's described often as a South African artist, with South Africa being his primary identifier, rather than the decades, almost 7 decades or so, that he spent in Europe interacting with European modernists. Mancoba married the Danish artist Sonia Fellow in 1942. That's her right there. And they both exhibited in Copenhagen from 1948 to 1949. He met Frolov through friends from the École Nationale Supérieure des Arts Décoratifs, and their son Wonga was born in 1946. To escape discrimination as a biracial couple, they moved to a village outside Copenhagen in 1947, where both worked as members of the host group of artists. Frolov introduced Mancoba to the newly formed group named Cobra, and that's the members of the Cobra artists in a group photograph in 1948. That's Mancoba right there, second from left in the background. Frolov introduced Mancoba to the newly formed group named Cobra, and both of them participated in Cobra's activities. However, Mancoba and Frolov had significant ideological differences with the Cobra group, who were less interested in anti-colonial orientation of Mancoba and Frolov, and their solidarity with colonized people. Mancoba noted that these differences contributed to their isolation from the Cobra group, and it later invalidated them in the appreciation of the official art world, especially later in the eyes and evaluations of some critics and historians. Whereas Frolov is often mentioned in relation to the Cobra group, no official history of the Cobra group has ever included Mancoba as a member, even though, as you can see, he was actually, quite central to the group's operation in its early days. So, Mancoba and Frolov opted not to participate in the 1949 Cobra exhibition at the Stedelijk Museum, and due to this absence, Mancoba was enlisted in the exhibition's catalog. Subsequent narratives of the Cobra group omitted him completely, and he languished in art historical obscurity only until recently. Mancoba's importance lies in his challenge to modernist primitivism and his use of abstract art to engage with and deconstruct modernist tropes. For Mancoba and other African intellectuals of his generation, complete abstraction carried the danger of alienation from cultural and political concerns. An African doing abstract art at this point was considered merely a mimic of European modernists, which is kind of interesting since the Europeans doing modern art, using African forms, weren't considered critics of African primitive art. So perhaps to preempt any such misreading while retaining key lessons from abstraction, Mancoba introduced elements from African material culture into his art and abstracted them, resulting in a deep amalgamation of indigenous African and modernist European formal aesthetics. This tactic would animate Mancoba's production for the rest of his career. And you can see in these two works here, this is the painting on the right at the bottom, is Sonia Fellow's composition, Oil on Canvas, 1938. This one is a Mancoba piece titled Masks from 1947. And you can see how in his reference to masks, he was trying to return to a certain category of representation that included African forms. Mancoba's art poses a challenge to art history because of an inability to interpret his orientation to abstract art. Critics found his work enigmatic. His watercolor paintings, in particular, anticipated abstract expressionism, but are often overlooked in narratives of modern art. The lesson in citing Mancoba's pioneering foray into abstraction is not to establish precedence or preeminence for the artist, but rather to critique the perennial art historical insistence on pigeonholing artists of color, irrespective of the nature of their work. Uh, Wherever artists such as Mancoba sought to escape compartmentalization, critics and scholars often work at cross purposes by qualifying their abstraction as African or Black. This insistence on reading Black artists only through the rubric of race marginalizes them in art history discourses. Mancoba spent his career as an artist fighting against this kind of marginalization. Gerard Sekoto, Songs of Exile. Sekoto was born in the Transvaal in 1913, a year marked by the introduction of the forced segregation legislation passed by the Parliament of South Africa. This legislation was called the Natives Land Act, and it was a series of measures taken by the then white South African government to exploit, alienate, and degrade non-white or Black South Africans. Remember, there are also South Africans of Asian ancestry and biracial ancestry, so non-white is used here very technically. To alienate and degrade non-white South Africans that followed the Land Act, which was what drove Sekoto into self-imposed exile in Paris, where he stayed until his death in 1993. Sekoto arrived in Paris in 1947, but his career was already on an upswing before his exile. He had won second prize for painting in a competition organized by Fort Hare University College in 1938. Encouraged by this achievement, he moved to Sophiatown, a suburb of Johannesburg, to pursue a career as a full-time artist. Sekoto had developed a close friendship with Ernest Mancoba, both of whom attended Grace Dieu and taught at Kaiso Secondary School in Polokwane. According to Chabani Mangai, Mancoba prompted Sekoto to develop his grand plan to move, first to Johannesburg, then to Cape Town, and finally to Paris. In 1942, Sekoto relocated to Cape Town, where he interacted with white South African artists. Up to this point, his art mostly documented Black life at the fringes of the urban metropole. He exhibited his works in a number of galleries in Cape Town and achieved significant recognition. However, concerns about achieving his full potential under South Africa's marginalization of Blacks ultimately caused him to leave the country. So this Sekoto self-portrait is sort of an example of the kind of work he was doing in 1947. You will notice that he already had moved away from pure naturalism, as it were, to a more stylized, modernist kind of palette in his work. Think Cezanne and post-impressionists, and you get a sense of what he was doing. Then he developed this technique based on studies of Egyptian art, where he lined up people in these overlapping formations. This one is Song of the Peak from 1947 also. As a Black artist, Sekoto faced very limited opportunities. Sorry, as a Black artist, Sekoto faced a very limited horizon of opportunity, which makes his overall experiences, including his self-imposed exile to Paris, remarkable. He was a Christian and the son of a priest and a teacher, and Sekoto, in this regard, belonged to a new South African Black elite. And that Black elite was documented most memorably in the works of Santu Mofokeng, the late South African photographer. In this project called the Black Photo Album, Santu Mofokeng, juxtaposes images of this Black South African elite with questions about whether their appearance and their adoption of, what was then European forms of dress, evidence of mental colonization, or whether they serve to challenge prevailing images of the African in the Western world. This juxtaposition here shows the kind of anthropological imagery that would often be used to represent Black South Africans. And these are those same people, in different kinds of attire and dress. So Sekoto's work reflects what John Peffer defined as a struggle for a non-racial aesthetic practice in South Africa. And his paintings of urban life played a key role in the development of Black South African art. There were also experiments with modernist styles and patronage. His audience and principal collectors were white middle-class patrons, critics, and artists. He also interacted with the New Group, and that's a photograph of the New Group members right there, a collective of progressive South African young artists who studied in Europe and who in the 1930s opposed the conservative values championed by the institutional South African Society of Artists. The South African Society of Artists was modeling itself on the Royal Academy of Artists in Britain and on French Beaux-Arts, style academic art. Founding members of this new group include Gregoire Bonzaya, whom we see in the portrait below, who was also elected as his first chairman. Lippi Lifshitz, we've mentioned, in regard to her interaction with Mancoba. Frida Locke, Cecil Hicks, and Terence McCall. According to John Peffer, Sekoto met with members Julie Gluckman and Alexis Perelier. He painted alongside them and learned the rudiments of working in oil paints in Gluckman's studio. These interactions were part of what Peffer defined as gray areas, sites and locations where Black and white South African artists and culture workers mingled. They primed Sekoto's decision to leave South Africa. Sekoto was therefore an already established artist when he arrived in Paris. He paid for his trip abroad with proceeds from successful solo exhibitions. And unlike Mancoba, he retained his figurative style and continued to create art that chronicled immediate social realities. He used this style to document South Africa's political and social issues, as well as scenes from his life in Paris. Sekoto did not speak French when he arrived in the city, and he faced personal and professional challenges in his first 2 years there, fighting depression and poverty. He lived in a tiny apartment, attended drawing classes during the day at the Académie La Grande Chaumière, and worked in various bars and nightclubs as a piano player to earn additional income. You can see that reflected in a lot of his paintings from that period. He documented his experience in paintings of Parisian bars and jazz musicians and would ultimately become an alcoholic with deleterious impact on his health from mingling too much in this environment. Mancoba noted that it was easy for an artist, and especially a Black artist, to feel isolated in Paris, and many artists have died there in loneliness and poverty. Sekoto was somewhat lucky in this regard. A chance encounter with Raymond Cardon and his wife Esclozin, who owned the Gallery Esclozin, afforded him an introduction to the Paris Gallery circuit. They held a solo exhibition of his work in 1948, which opened to favorable reviews, and although it did not garner adequate sales, it brought Sekoto some attention. He subsequently developed a rich social life, mingling with writers, artists, and academics from all over the world who were living in Paris, many of whom were, like him, exiles from their homeland. Through this interaction, Sekoto became involved with the Pan-African movement, contributing to Présence Africaine, the literary and cultural journal founded by Senegalese intellectual Léopold Sédar Senghor and Aimé Césaire, the Martinican, who invited him to attend the Second Conference of Negro Writers and Artists organized in Rome in 1959. Sekoto's reputation grew steadily, and the following years saw him exhibiting fairly extensively, both in Paris and further afield in Stockholm, Vichy, Venice, Namur, Senegal, Denmark, the USA, and in South Africa, where his work was exhibited in various cities like Pretoria, Johannesburg, and Cape Town. Sekoto poses a dilemma for art history because there is a tendency to essentialize his art by relating it to his ethnicity and nationality. Despite living in France from 1947 until he died in 1993, a total of 54 years, he has been recovered for art history as a quintessential South African artist, which disregards completely the extent of his modernist experiments in painting. And these modernist experiments in painting can actually be best seen in these two artworks that I have on the screen. From his, residence in Egoli, which is what the Zulu South Africans call Johannesburg, Egoli, which means city of gold. And these two works, Portrait of a Young Girl in 1970 and then Girl with Downcast Eye from 1955, showed, that he had actually perfected a technique that, was very much conversant with modernist experiments in painting and representation. But he also developed, quite a very unique style. So his artworks are yet to be fully integrated into the discourse of modernism, or evaluated in terms of his contemporary practice in France. We need to interrogate this insistence on Sekoto's African identity against the cosmopolitan framework of his life as an exile in Paris. It is vital to narrate Sekoto within this larger social landscape to save the artist from ideological narratives defined solely by nationality, race, or ethnicity. Gazbia Sirry, race, gender, and power. The Egyptian artist Gazbia Sirry died on November 10, 2021 at the age of 96, bringing to a close one of the most extraordinary modernist careers by any African artist. Born in 1925, and this is where histories become kind of really complicated. Gazbia Sirry was born in 1925 to an aristocratic Turkish family living in Cairo. She spent the least amount of time studying or living in Paris than any of the other artists discussed in this essay. Sirry was raised by her widowed mother and divorced grandmother in a predominantly female household, and both ensured she received a broad international education. Note a common theme that's going on here. A lot of these artists belonged to elite communities in their own, countries. Sirry obtained a diploma from the Higher Institute for Young Women in Cairo in 1948 and subsequently studied painting and engraving with Marcel Gromer in Paris in 1951. She furthered her studies at the Egyptian Academy in Rome in 1952 and took paintings and lithography classes at the Slade School of Fine Arts in London from 1954 to 1955. This was an extraordinarily cosmopolitan and international education that the artist acquired. She returned to Cairo and taught art and art education for 2 decades before striking out as an independent artist in protest against a state ban on figure drawing and nude models. The institutions Sirry studied in emphasized figurative imagery and a reliance on canonical modes of academic instruction in art. This makes her progression from figuration to abstraction all the more remarkable. And you can see basically what style of abstraction she ended up with, which, as you can note here, still included quite clear references to figurative, imagery. How can we chart the impact of Sirry's sojourn in Paris on her art, given the short tenure of her education in the city? We must look to her studies with Marcel Gromer for answers. Gromer was immersed in the Parisian art world and gained early recognition after exhibiting at the Salon des Indépendants in 1911. He received advice on art from Henri Matisse, frequented Parisian art academies, and staked out ground as a figurative painter whose realist images insisted on the importance of the subject in modern art. In time, he became associated with social realism, but was more of an independent artist who refused to be locked into any group or movement. Sirry was an equally independent artist who refused to be bound by prevailing conventions. She developed an early, feminist consciousness early in life, and women of all social classes were recurrent protagonists in her work. Gromer's social realism style reinforced Sirry's orientation to social issues, but one must caution against claims of direct influence, since she was involved in nationalist debates about the struggle for modern identity in Egypt before she left for Cairo. However, elements of Gromer's style persisted in Sirry's painting through her career, from her early focus on scenes of domesticity to abstract paintings suffused by primary colors outlined in bold yellow, brown, and black lines. Sirry was committed to social and political commentary, and her art was firmly rooted in the rhetoric of Egyptian cultural politics, which significantly contributed to the discourse of nationalism, cultural emancipation, gender politics, and individual freedoms within the sovereign modern Egyptian state. Her art and career evinced the feminist consciousness of what it meant to be a modern Egyptian in a world of conflicting and complementary political, cultural, and artistic ideologies. Her paintings also investigated the politics of race in Egyptian culture through its divergent representations of Egyptians, and which refers mainly to Egyptians of Arab ancestry, and then Nubians, blacks, who, despite the fact that we have very clear evidence the original inhabitants of Egypt were black people, are kind of seen as outsiders in modern Egyptian culture. And you can see that in these, paintings here. This is a painting of an Egyptian family, and this is a painting of a Nubian family. So the differences between, this is the Nubian painting, by the way, and this is the Egyptian family. The differences in skin tone here is kind of used in a very subtle manner. But the painting matter here also shows, the involvement of these young men and women in political struggles. So Sirry's divergent representations of Egyptians and Nubians reflects Egypt's own ambivalence about the role of Blacks in its history and about Egypt's own place in Africa. Sirry's paintings evolved through several distinct phases through her career, but were grounded by her search for the essence of Egyptian identity in all its facets. So Egypt's heritage of pharaonic, Islamic, and modern identities created multiple polarities. And the heterogeneity, the eclecticism and heterogeneity we find in modern Egyptian art, thus provided points of contestation and engagement in Sirry's artworks through her career. Iba Ndiaye, Art, Ideology, and Sacrifice. Pioneer Senegalese modern artist Iba Ndiaye arrived in Paris in 1948 to study art. He was born in 1928 in St. Louis, Senegal, to a Catholic mother and Muslim father, whose unusual union reflected the cosmopolitan ambience of a city that was long celebrated as a cultural melting pot since the 15th century, when the Portuguese established Gorée, an island off the coast of Senegal, as a principal node of the transatlantic slave trade. During the colonial period, during France's colonization of Senegal, in other words, Dakar was a major regional port, and in 1902, it replaced St. Louis as the capital of French West Africa. The French presence remains very strong in Dakar, and its hybrid mix of indigenous African and French cultures is reflected in its description as the Paris of Africa. It's never a good thing when you are the something of something else. It always involves a kind of lesser position, as it were. But nevertheless, the traffic between Paris and Dakar is intense. It's a very short flight, about 4.5 hours or 5 hours or so from one point to the other. And you have tons of Dakarois or Senegalese who actually simultaneously live both in Paris and Dakar, which is a very interesting thing. Ndiaye trained as an architect in Senegal before moving on to France for further education. From 1949 to 1958, he studied at the École de Beaux-Arts in Montpellier, the Académie de la Grande Chaumière, and the École de Beaux-Arts in Paris, which at this time, was one of the world's most prestigious art schools. He subsequently apprenticed in the sculpture studios of the Russian-born avant-garde artist Ochip Zadkine, or Joseph Aronovich Zadkin, and Pierre Cotin, a painter and engraver. Zadkin, who was friends with Pablo Picasso, reputedly introduced Ndiaye to Cubism's experiments with African sculpture. His art shows Cotin's influence in its orientation to expressionist brushwork and an atonal color palette. This is the Russian artist, French-Russian artist Ochip Zadkin in his studio. You can see many of his sculptures in the background. This is an example of one of his early paintings, and this is one of the sculptures he's most known for. Now, Ndiaye co-founded training programs in Senegal that contributed to one of Africa's most exciting modern and contemporary art movements, the École de Dakar. In 1959, Léopold Senghor, the first president of independent Senegal, invited Ndiaye to head the Department of Plastic Arts section of the newly formed school in Dakar. Ndiaye worked along Senegalese artist Papa Ibra Tall, who headed the school's other section for research in Black plastic arts. And Ndiaye, considered, Tall's, Papa Ibra Tall was very strictly proponent of negritude search for Africanness. And Ndiaye considered this search to be problematic and insisted that the students must adapt African and Western art traditions to create a new and modern African art. For Ndiaye, the idea of essentialist African identities, which is a central tenet of Senghorian negritude, round counter to the cosmopolitan heritage of African artists who emerged from African cities where indigenous culture had long combined with foreign influences to birth modern subjects. He became disillusioned with the ideological orientation of the Dakar School and returned to France in 1967. And French culture exerted a really great influence on Ndiaye. He was particularly intrigued by the vibrant Parisian jazz scene as were numerous other African artists in Paris. Nevertheless, his paintings used figurative and symbolic imagery to represent important African cultural ideals. He produced 10 paintings featuring rams in a series on the theme of Tabaski, a Senegalese ceremony marking the end of the Islamic holy month of Ramadan, which was celebrated every year through the sacrifice of rams. His paintings of rams awaiting slaughter are reminiscent in many ways of similar images by the Paris-based Belarusian painter Haim Sultan and British figurative painter Francis Bacon, who spent a year and a half in Paris from 1927 to 1929. Sultan was already painting butchered animals when Ndiaye arrived in Paris, as was Francis Bacon, whose paintings were included in the 1946 UNESCO exhibition I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. We can't read Ndiaye's fascination with French culture to imply his wholesale acceptance of France's colonial and imperial history in Africa. He was fully aware of the contradiction between French ideals of liberty and its treatment of both colonized Africans and African-American artists whose culture and performance, especially jazz music, it celebrated. Ndiaye captured this contradiction in his best-known painting, titled Wando Pareja, Menaced by Dogs, done in 1986, which very directly references Diego Velázquez's portrait of Wando Pareja, which we see here. And this is Ndiaye's version of the painting. Wando Pareja was Velázquez's Morisco slave studio assistant and an artist in his own right. He was manumitted by his master in 1954. In Ndiaye's interpretation, Pareja is shown in his studio staring languidly at the viewer while a pack of dogs, with bared white fangs loom over the artist from the right side of the canvas. Pareja had secretly taught himself to paint, even though, Pareja had secretly taught himself to paint, even though Spanish law forbade such education for slaves. And this is an example of Pareja's painting. He was quite a very competent, artist in the style of Velázquez himself. So Pareja thus lived in mortal fear of being discovered and punished by his master. Velázquez's portrait of Wando Pareja was the first painting to sell for more than £1 million, in an ironic record, as it were, of how the embodied image of a Morisco slave continued to reap immense profits for various white owners long after his death. Ndiaye likened Pareja's situation to the ambivalent and fraught relationship between Europeans and Blacks, Africans and African Americans alike, in the Black Atlantic's history of slavery and colonialism. For African artists and intellectuals under colonialism, the French policy of assimilation proved an impossible ideal, since acculturated Blacks were confronted with their dark skins as a permanent marker of difference. Nevertheless, Ndiaye believed in Senghor's project of a universal humanism, and throughout his career, his paintings expressed these ideals, even as they critiqued France's inability to live up to it. So in conclusion, the artists I've described in this essay of Onabolu, Mancoba, Sekoto, Gazbia, and Ndiaye, they all engage cosmopolitan identity in Paris and also in their own African cities. The brief histories above highlight the diversity of their education and interaction with European avant-garde, both in Paris and in their wide range of international modern artists that they met. These African artists engaged cosmopolitan modernism and used Pan-African and negritude ideologies to negotiate the politics of race in France. Do we run a risk of reinstating colonial norms in analysis of African modern artists by using their sojourn in Paris as a key marker of their professional practice? Not necessarily. African artists encountered great constraints in their efforts to engage modernism, both in their colonized homelands and in Paris. Colonial governments constrained their practice at home, and when they migrated to the West, they faced institutions that still perceived them as primitives. If they defied this perception, they were ignored and simply written out of history, as was the case with Mancoba. I have therefore argued that we need a more complex analysis of the various contexts in which modern African art developed, so as not to minimize its international orientation or cosmopolitan origins. So, Rashid Arain notes that mere citation of the international sojourns of this artist is not enough. it must be accompanied by a critical analysis or reading of their work that recognizes its historical importance to the main body of ideas. I'm almost done, by the way. Within modernism, and through this, claim Africa's place in its genealogies. Promoting cosmopolitan perspectives of practice does not deny African artists' engagement with Pan-Africanism, anti-colonialism, and nationalism, or challenge their identities as modern artists. Rather, we simply note that there has always been a high degree of circulation between France and citizens of African nations that emerged from its former African colonies. And this proves that African artists operated in international context and invalidates any effort to read their work through a primitivist perspective. We also note the large African-American presence in Paris in the 1920s and the pursuit of greater freedoms denied them by Jim Crow policies in the USA, whose oppressive and lethal violence often proved an existential threat to Black life. The jazz music they created, a veritable soundtrack to the unfolding of global modernism in Paris, was used by African artists such as Mancoba, Sekoto, and Ndiaye to form links with African-American intellectuals. And it's thus credible to say that Paris represented a freer context of freedom for modern African artists in general. The paradox, of course, is such freedom contrasts with the violent history of French colonial subjugation that subjected African artists to surreal violence in the name of empire. This paradox persists in the contemporary era, but Paris remains an important context of symbolic and political importance that continues to attract Black artists. Thank you.